personally belong to a family who migrated as a refugee from Pakistani Punjab.
So the diaspora does not give funds alone, but it also provides ideas, skills, and knowledge for developmental activities.
The internal migrant labor force in Europe that actually facilitated an industrial revolution.
The Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora has an identity of being a Tamil and being a Sri Lankan.
The links between education and mobility in the context of a very strong culture of migration.
UAE is the largest destination of Indian diaspora, followed by the United States of America.
Gulf outside Kerala has created a Gulf within Kerala itself.
Work from home is not for the migrant workers. They have to go outside and they have to work.
Thank you, Dr. Pushpam, for inviting me to this webinar. And good afternoon to all. This is Dr. Muneer, working as assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at University of Allahabad. And I thank the organizers, especially Dr. Jayagumar, who has been with us in the Diaspora Research Committee for Diaspora and Migration Studies of Indian Sociological Society. So thank you, Dr. Jayagumar, for inviting me, and thank you the Department of Sociology, especially Pushpam, Professor Anthony Palakal, and all those who have made this event a grand success. So before I get into this debate, that the topic for my discussion, let me also give a bit introduction about the kind of debates that we have in this seminar. So in the morning session, we have two interesting presentations by Professor Paramjit Singh Judge and Professor Azailu Newmai, which actually looked into some of the recent debates of Indian diaspora. Then I thought I will also look into the internal diaspora or the internal migration as an important component of understanding development and dynamism of Indian society. So this topic, that interrogating demographic dividend, the social roots of migrant vulnerabilities, as my paper titled, it actually emerged in the context of a hysteric claim of a demographic dividend in India and its possible flight to the windows of opportunities. That somewhere in the journalist, the public domain, the economist, and the academia in general have been talking about a possible demographic dividend, where the kind of changes that are happening in the demographic structure of India would lead India into an economic superpower by opening the windows of opportunities. So as sociologists, our job is to look into the way in which such kind of claims are actually grounded in society and in social realities. So I have looked into some of the reviews of literature, reports, and surveys, and argues that until and unless we explore the heterogeneity of India's migrant labor force and its roots of vulnerabilities and distress, a debate of the efficacy of a demographic dividend would be incomplete and sometimes futile. So with this claim, let me start my presentation. So we all have actually seen a devastating pandemic, and the core of that was the entire 2020, probably from month of March. Though the scale of this pandemic has come down considerably, still the fear of this pandemic looms large. So starting with this debate, that much of the debate on the possible economic boom brought by the recent shift in India's demographic structure a decline in fertility and an increase in the share of working age population, and subsequent decline in the dependent population. So when we look into the demographic dividend, these three components are very important. One is the kind of fertility decline that had actually happened or that has been happening since 1990, which actually reduced the number of children in the age group of 0 to 6, and slowly that spilled over to the working age population. And at another end of the demographic spectrum, the people in the old age are not increasing as much as actually it had increased or it is increasing in the Western world or some of the developed nations in Asia and other parts of the world. So what actually happens is the sharp decline in the dependent population by virtue of reduction in the fertility rate and not much of increase in the elderly population. So what happened is the thickening of working age population over a period of time, and then that also lead to, when we look into the economic terms, that reduction of dependency from both the side, both the young dependency and old dependency. So this has actually been given very scant attention, has been given attention in the debates of media, in the debates of public domain, and to some extent the civil society debates, and also debates about development and economic opportunities in India. But if we look deeply into some of the structural bottlenecks that India is offered with because of the diversity of its population structure, and somewhere we will have to look deeply into the heterogeneity, quality, and efficacy of this demographic structure or demographic category, that is the working age population. So it was believed that this working age population, that probably 15 to 59 age group, which is actually increasing and thickening, and there is a possibility of they becoming a kind of opening the windows of opportunities for economic growth and taking India into the flight of new windows of opportunities. But having said this, when we look deeply into migration as an important phenomena and how migrant labor force has been an important cog in this debate of development, then we do not find a very pleasant picture. So this is the core of this paper. This paper explores the possibility and challenges of a demographic dividend in India with a special focus on the diversities and dynamics of internal migration in the country. So basically, I'm looking at the diversities and dynamics of internal migration in the country, that somewhere I'm not making a kind of homogeneous category or migrants as a homogeneous category. Rather would argue that the heterogeneity of migrant labor force stand at the core of India's migrant labor force. The study assumes that the major social determinants of development, like productivity, mobility, and quality of workforce, is heavily dependent on the degree of distress that migrants experience, including agrarian crisis, informality of labor force, footloose labor in a neoliberal space, neglect of social security measures like education and employment, possibility of thickening the skilled labor force, etc. So when we look at demographic dividend sociologically, we'll also have to look into the recent debates about sustainable development, where it is said that any kind of workforce or any kind of demographic category has to have free, independent a choice and avenues for well-being, which probably do not or has not been offered to India's vast majority of migrant labor force, who are in many, in the words of, for instance, Jean Breman, a footloose labor, who are neither strongly held their roots in the village nor in the city. So they are in circulation and informal. So this kind of workforce, which actually constitute the core of India's workforce, definitely need to be incorporated and seriously looked into any kind of debate of demographic dividend. So when we look deeply into this, the kind of migrant labor force, then it actually present itself as a labor force with so much of informality, footloose in the neoliberal space, where the cities have been built on the basis of preferences of the capitalist system, where they do not need to or they do not want the labor to be fully accommodated to the city. Rather, they treat them as what we call a kind of tool in the hands of the capitalist workforce. So neglect of social security measures like education and employment. Some of the workforce, means informal workforce that we see, that there are recent debates. For instance, a recent book by Shiva Kumar and Professor Irudayarajan actually speaks about the kind of poor inputs that migrants are actually associated with in terms of health, in terms of employment, in terms of education. So these are some of the major sources of human capital which would take the possible dream of demographic dividend. So I will look little deeply into this migrant labor force, and I will look deeply into the vulnerabilities that they are associated with. So while locating the study, the efficiency and agility of this dynamic workforce is dependent on historical and structural conditions that result in their motive to migrate, resources for migration, and the strength of network and sustainability in the place of origin as well as destinations. So here the first part of my paper is to look deeply into the historical condition of this migrant labor force, that what make them to come to the city. Is it because they feel cities are attractive, or is it because they do not have any options in the village when the economic sector, especially the sectoral reforms, actually shift from agriculture to services or construction work, or many other sectors, tertiary and secondary and tertiary sectors. So what happens is that agriculture becomes unviable, and people seriously look for bigger pastures outside their rural hinterlands. This paper, conceived in the context of a perceived advantage of India over the other countries of South Asia or elsewhere in terms of huge reserve of population in the working category and drastic decline in the dependent population. So this is the essence of this demographic dividend. However, despite this demographic dividend that would have actually taken India into an economic superpower, the recent outcomes and policy initiative do not suggest any corresponding indices of an economic boom. Rather leaves a kind of more indication of multiple angles of counterproductivity. Some of the recent debates about the educational skills, employability, then lack of skill development, all actually amount to a debate which actually interrogate the demographic dividend in India. So the study has looked into the way in which a global shift from rural agrarian social life to an urban industrial work and life has affected the dynamics of migration in India, and what are the challenges for this spatial movement for envisioning it as a sign of economic progress and as a move towards demographic dividend. So as many scholars who have looked into the neoliberal space in urban areas have found that there is a clear-cut shift from people, in terms of people's employment opportunities and preferences from rural and agrarian to urban and industrial area. But at the same time, how far their input to be absorbed in the city or their reception in the city or in the urban spaces are a serious matter of concerns. I'll get back to that later. Let me stay a little longer with the debate of demographic dividend, that there seems to be a lot of optimistic appraisal over the possible economic revival in India due to a slow but steady shift in the demographic structure of the country. This phenomena, popularly known as demographic dividend, denote a possible economic growth which occurs due to shift in the age structure of the population, mainly when the share of working population increases and is well over the share of dependent population. So this is actually part of a demographic transition where there is a stage at which the dependent population will be declining, or it is still far lower than the working age population. So India has a potential for demographic dividend, but when we look deeply into the structures and sources of vulnerabilities, then that demographic dividend actually does not happen. So in the demographic transition, population dividend occurs when fertility rate falls and the youth dependency rate declines. Okay, so the relative bulge in working age population has a potential for faster economic growth and fewer burden on families. So so it is also believed that India is going to actually overcome China in terms of its most populous country in the world and having a huge share of population in the younger age. Okay, that most probably within half a decade, India is going to surpass China in terms of population. So this demographic transition, along with resources for human capital and economic boom, has a potential to channelize the country into a developed nation. So this is what actually demographic dividend is all about, and locating migration in this demographic dividend. However, much debates of a demographic dividend in India tends to sidestep the deep-rooted structural bottlenecks which prevent the working age population from effectively reaping the benefits of this demographic dividend, which many countries of Asian miracle have achieved. So, we are not going far to the European countries, but looking at some of the Asian countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Japan, and many Singapore, the kind of Asian miracle actually had happened when this kind of population, where the dependent population has been reduced, and the working age population has positively contributed to the development of the country. So as India's largest human capital, the floating informal and seasonal migrant labor force continue to live in distress, unable to survive with the meager return from agriculture or allied activities, and barely accepted in India's urban space as residents. Beyond a temporary worker, their poor link with India's economic growth drive poses a serious challenge to the vision of a demographic dividend. This is one of the important point I wanted to make in this presentation, that if you look at India's human capital, these informal, floating, seasonal, and circulating migrant labor force is definitely one of the important cog in the development of the country, but many a times it was not found that how far they have been actually deprived, how far they have been suffering from some of the structural bottlenecks like lack of employment opportunities in their rural hinterlands, or lack of adequate educational opportunities or health facilities. This lead to what we call a kind of migrant in circulation, where their foot is not strongly held on the ground. Because if they get money around, for instance, if they are getting a daily wage of 150 rupees, if they get 160 or even 170, they are ready to migrate because of the distress and survival strategy that they have learned. This is what actually Jean Breman called a footloose labor, and this worker barely accepted in India's urban space. So if they have left the village because of multiple disadvantages, it is not that they have been accepted in the city as a fellow citizen, rather they have been treated as just a worker, not even a resident. So their poor link with India's economic growth drive poses a serious challenge to the vision of demographic dividend. So, let me go back to what we call how migration can be considered as a catalyst for development. As migration serves as one of the oldest action against poverty and discrimination, and migrant constitutes as the important category in the process of development. This spatial movement reflects both as a causal factor as well as a potential for expansion of social and economic opportunities, and in turn an important cog in the democratization of development. So thus migrant as a processual as well as a collective category has been deemed as a powerful force that can potentially change the economic and political landscape of any country. So when we look at migrants, they have a strong powerful force to change the economic and political landscape of the country. But at the same time, we also have to look into the heterogeneity of migrant labor force, their bargaining power, their acceptance, their distress, which actually needs to be looked deeply into when, if at all we are trying to make a linkage between demographic dividend, development, and migrant labor force. However, migrant as a powerful vehicle of economic productivity and mobility can never be treated as a homogeneous entity, as their potentialities and possibilities are mediated and determined by their socioeconomic positions and the extent to which they enjoy freedom of social, spatial, economic, and political mobility. This debate actually gives the heterogeneous picture of India's migrant labor force and even the policies towards migrant labor force adopted by different states. The distress of this migrant labor force was mirrored, and it was well in the public domain when the pandemic had happened. So when we look, for instance, migrants and sustainability, look at some of the recent documents, especially the document released by UNDP and UNFPA. The underlines that they actually speak about, it's not that all the migrants will be contributing effectively to the development process. Rather, migrants will be the reflection of a larger burden and pain that a country or is actually suffering from or experiencing. So it is trying to say that avenues to fulfill potentials, ensuring rights and choices, expanding possibilities for women and young people to lead healthy and productive lives. So when we look at migrant labor force, we will also have to look into their possibilities and potential to become a strong human capital in terms of having rights and choices and avenues to fulfill potentials, expanding possibilities for the younger population to lead a healthy and productive life. It is not often the real picture. So, however, it was observed by recent report of UNFPA, for instance, 2016, that young migrants seeking employment opportunities are often exposed to urban environment without adequate support base in terms of influence, network, and access to information, thereby falling prey to risk and exploitation. So the partial and inadequate accommodation and incorporation of India's floating, informal, and marginalized labor force definitely poses a challenge to sustainability, which we otherwise would have thought will take a flight into India's windows for opportunity and an economic and a demographic dividend. So it was also found that labor force in the unorganized sectors are likely to meet multiple challenges of access to quality education, affordable health services, and meeting the basic needs of well-being. As you might have heard some of the debates of basic development and well-being, where access to opportunities, education, health services are actually completely denied to this workforce, which constitute the core of India's demographic dividend. So let me speak a little bit about what we call the characteristics of internal migration in India. So I'll not go deeply into this because I have already spoken many aspects of that. But India's internal migrant labor force is still to incorporate the people who have, for instance, people who have migrated from the fringes of the city or the villages adjacent to the city, who are coming to the city for work and going back to their home. They are actually not called migrants in any kind of migrant literature, but their vulnerabilities and their potentials are almost the same. So there are actually problems with the debates of what constitute India's migrant labor force. So unlike the pattern of internal migration that largely industrial Europe, where the migrants brought their families along to the cities and the city administration had arranged public housing schemes. See, so when you look at the internal migrant labor force in Europe, that actually facilitated an industrial revolution. India's migrant labor force has been, largely male-centered, and were largely unprotected by the kind of residential permission that had been offered to people in urban areas of Europe. So it is found that the circulating migrants are often made to live without a proper shelter and do not enjoy the comfort of privacy. So their informality is characterized by transience of their work permit. So these are some of the debates that actually has come in a recent book by Ranbir Samandar, who in 2008 he speaks about that. It is definitely the distress that lead the rural workforce to the cities, but when it comes to accommodation, they have not been fully integrated to the cities. Rather they have been treated as the tenants in the city. This is where I try to argue the roots of migrant vulnerabilities. So while the recent changes in the demographic structures, both in Africa and in some of the Asian countries, calls for attention of possible demographic dividend, this demographic dividend advantages always stand the scrutiny of the quality of population in terms of empowerment, investment, and new opportunities in the employment structure of respective countries. So any incorporation of the migrant force into India's emerging labor force, or what we call emerging capital, also needs to look into the serious concerns of empowerment and investment and providing new opportunities to people who are coming to the urban centers. So empowering people to take up the right choice need corrective measures from the part of national government to enhance opportunities and possibilities which otherwise had been denied to vast majority of young population. So this is where actually we are trying to interrogate the possibility of a demographic dividend. And see, when we look at the recent cases of COVID-19 and vulnerabilities, this was just the reflection of the vulnerabilities and distress these migrant labor force, who were largely unnoticed and undocumented in India's migrant statistics, that how deep is their vulnerability and how less they are protected by the social welfare measures. So the COVID-19 pandemic and its let me, I think, cut short that debate. So it is trying to make a point that that the COVID-19 pandemic and its ensuing regulatory measures by the government of India witnessed the plight of thousands of migrant workers across the country who were on desperate move to reach their home. It was India's migrant labor force which constitute nearly about 100 million, and majority of being the daily wage laborers that had to bear the brunt of a sudden and unprepared lockdown clamped by the government of India. It is still flashing in our memories that with a complete shutdown of work and workplaces and almost no transportation facilities on site, people started walking hundreds of kilometers on foot just to desperately reach their destinations. A vast majority of these migrants who were badly longing to reach their home were more worried about their survival during the lockdown rather than being swayed by the fear of coronavirus. So many of the many times the migrants were accused of violating the rules and regulations of lockdown, but they would argue that, see, they were actually more worried about their survival and their being saved from death. So openly flaunting the regulations of hygiene, social distancing, and quarantine during the lockdown, this largely informal workforce felt that the kind of economic survival and the fear of slipping into deep poverty always mattered them the most, rather than the kind of protocols clamped during the pandemic, which they felt were largely meant for the privileged. So, treating India's population as a homogeneous category who will be able to withstand the immediate and unprepared clampdown unprepared clamping of a lockdown is actually exposed when thousands of migrants were crying, foul, saying that it is not meant for us. For us, our survival is more important, and lockdown is largely meant for the privileged. So this situation unearths a deep-seated trouble that India's migrant force is pregnant with. A survey conducted, for instance, SWAN, Stranded Workers Action Network, in Delhi among around more than 11,000 migrant workers who were trapped in their workplaces during lockdown, revealed that three-fourths of them had only ration or money for the next 2 days. So many of the people who were trapped and were longing to reach their destination had only, means almost 75% had only had ration or provisions for 2 days, and that reflects their precarity and lack of social protection. So it is in this context that I am trying to interrogate the possible demographic dividend. Now, coming back to the debate of the roots of migrant vulnerabilities in the recent past, so much of the practices of urban spacing, okay, as observed by most influential theorists of urbanization, including Henry Lefebvre and David Harvey, seems to suggest that emerging forms of labor are hardly incorporated in the core policy intervention of neoliberal cities and are caught between the binaries of formal and informal economies. So we'll have to see how far the neoliberal capitalist economy, which is very much visible in India's urban space, is ready to incorporate this informal workforce and provide them the kind of adequate measures of social protection like housing, education, and health facilities is a matter of serious concern. Now, let me also speak a little bit about the other sources of migrant vulnerabilities. If you look at some of the recent debates about skill development, for instance, Government of India has brought up with the skill development, Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship. This is definitely a positive move, but it was found that the skill required for filling up the positions in India's labor force or workforce or the quality of the workforce has been substantially low, and that needs to be seriously looked into. For instance, a study by Christoph Jeffrello, in 2020, that revealed that almost every year 8 million India's workforce enter into the labor market, and the labor market is hardly able to incorporate all this labor force due to lack of resources, lack of expertise, lack of educational facilities, and in such situation, it is also contributing to the impossibility of a demographic dividend that we all are seriously concerned about. For instance, if India has to effectively tap the windows of opportunities opened up due to the demographic dividend, it is widely understood that it needs to educate its youth properly, both qualitatively and quantitatively. So it's not only about the literacy rate. Actually, the recent statistics would argue that even the India's migrant labor force, only 25% of them have a qualified degree or the possibility of joining the skilled labor force. So it is in this context we'll have to seriously think of increasing India's human capital. So let me conclude with these words that optimization of India's demographic dividend is contingent upon multiple conditions and factors which are deeply entangled in the structure, quality, and mobility of workforce in India, and the extent to which the existing policy initiatives are sensitive to and capable of addressing these bottlenecks. So when we look into the structural bottlenecks or structural backwardness of India's migrant labor force, then we hardly find solace in the kind of debates of demographic dividend in India, because we'll have to look deeply into the structure, quality, and mobility of workforce, which has rarely been discussed in either in academia or in civil society or in the debates of general public. Education is undoubtedly a critical cog in envisioning a demographic dividend, as higher education and skill development can effectively translate the educational output into human capabilities, gainful employment, and economic growth. So this trajectory of migrant labor force, starting from their distress and looking at their human capital and the possibilities of taking them into the higher height of India's demographic dividend, is the core of the debate when we try to look into the interlinkage between demographic dividend, development, and migration. Thank you.